Praising God for the times he gives us a chance to understand what he's called us to be and why. Let's call this chapter The War Against the Unjust. It seemed to encapsulate that whole concept of phrasing, because as much as the Bible talks about injustice, the whole concept of a literal war that heaven is waging against the unjust seemed to phrase it in a way that really hit with me. In this chapter, Hosea chapter 10, it starts off talking about the way that Israel is a luxurious vine. However, the more they prospered, the more their fruit increased, the more altars they built. Those are altars to false gods, not altars to the God of heaven, as he's also going to say in the latter half of verse 1, the more their country improved, likewise their pillars, also seemingly tokens or tributes to false gods. He's going to go on to say three things that actually follow or are followed by therefore statements. The first one in verse 2 is their heart was false, therefore they must now bear their guilt, as opposed to what we've seen before in situations where God, even for the guilty, is willing to forgive. This seems to be a situation where he is letting them know the fact that their heart is false, they're not legitimately trying to change, is one of those things that keeps them bound up in the guilt and the consequences on deck. Verse 3, going on to say that their privilege or their success once again has motivated them to say they don't fear the Lord. And in this particular era, they don't even see the benefit in having a king. Going on in verse 4 to the second statement that is going to be followed by a therefore, even if not literally, figuratively, when it's going to say that they have given themselves over to mere words and basically doing business or making agreements by empty oaths. Therefore, or so, judgment is going to spring up like poisonous weeds, he is going to say, as verse 5 goes on to describe the decline in their era of idolatry, saying it has and may continue to be marked by a decline in the joy they had in those idols and the glory they took in them, as Assyria's rise is going to mark the decline of Ephraim, metaphorically, or the literal name given to one of the larger or more significant tribes in Israel. It's also going to call them by the name of their capital, Samaria, saying that their king, or the king who sits in Samaria, is going to perish. Verse 8, going on to describe the way, as we saw in chapter 9, thorn and thistle are going to rise also in the absence of inhabited dwellings or places where they once might have congregated. Also, making a reference forward to the revelation, it's going to describe the way that they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us, in a statement that is used to describe the way that the great people of the earth, not necessarily just Israel, are going to call for some kind of refuge from God when they see that he really is, and he really is not happy. Going on in verse 9 to remind us of Gibeah that we saw mentioned in chapter 9. Once again, Gibeah was the place where a lot of this started when they did not heed the warning to not strike an agreement with the Canaanites, understanding that the people of Canaan were less likely to be influenced by Israel as they were to actually influence Israel. And just as Hosea chapter 1 seemed to mention a place called Jezreel, where there might have been some old and forgotten sins that God was now about to bring full circle by rendering judgment at the location where those sins were committed, God is now about to bring the sin or the indiscretion of trying to partner up with the unrighteous full circle at Gibeah, the place where his people began to go astray years ago. As verse 9 is reminding us, from the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel. There they have continued. Shall not the war against the unjust overtake them in Gibeah? Thus our title. Going on to talk about in verse 10, the fact that his justice takes place on his timing, and therefore it can be difficult for us to understand seeing prolonged seasons of injustice, thinking that God has forgotten them, but forgetting the example of places like Shechem in chapter 1 and Gibeah in chapters 9 and 10, that God can and will hold us accountable for old and even forgotten sins to the degree we remind him that we have not actually changed, no matter what we project on the outside. something he's going to make clear as Israel beats a path towards judgment in the rest of the chapter. As verse 11 is going to talk about, as we saw in the beginning of the chapter. Chapter 10, the way that he showed mercy to them, but the more they increased, the more they sinned. He's going to say that he took it easy on them like a trained calf, but they are now going into the days where he is going to put them in the yoke of bondage, where they will have to plow. But he's going to say, instead of plowing for others, it would be wise for them in verse 12 to plow or sow for themselves righteousness so that they can reap steadfast love, so that God will come to them with days in which he will rain righteousness upon them. However, verse 13, they have plowed iniquity, therefore they will reap injustice. They have eaten the fruit of lies because they have relied on their own way, or basically picking their own path regardless of what is right or wrong. And finally, being held down in their ability to do whatever they want, they trusted in their warriors or their might. Therefore, saying in verse 14, our last therefore statement, war will overtake them since they have leaned into the kind of habits that seem to produce conflict. Saying at the end, or in the final verse, verse 15, it is because of their great evil that these things are about to overtake them, concluding by saying, at dawn, the king of Israel will be utterly cut off. Something that was historically borne out in the fact that the only kingdom that would remain and be restored after the dispersion would be the line of kings that existed through David, the king of Judah, not the king of the northern 10 tribes of Israel. This passage, for whatever reason, reminding me of the passage from Isaiah that I think goes, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts and his ways are higher than our ways. Reminding me of that quite possibly because of the way that in days like now, injustice really seems to be a life choice, even for, and sometimes especially for, those in the church who are called to be God's people. But much like Israel seemed to consider injustice a life choice, in a time when God had declared war on injustice, they found out over time that in participating or cozying up to the things that God had declared war on, eventually, as we have seen in the prophets leading up to this point, God was going to seemingly treat his people as if he had also declared war on them. Something that, as we have mentioned before, we will likewise see in the cautions and warnings he gives us in the Revelation.